data-based leadership is important in schools and how it provides principals with opportunities to promote freedom for teachers. Essentially what this one is talking about is if teachers have access to an understanding of and are able to analyse sensibly the data sets that are available to them, they become that much more powerful in actually responding to the needs of students, which is ultimately what everything has to be driven by, is improving the outcomes for all of our students in all of our schools. Another one that I'm particularly fond of, which actually comes from our colleagues in the ACT, is one that talks about knowledge building schools. Now, a knowledge building school is one where all staff and students and leaders are actually involved in trying to make sure that we are using data in that sensible way. What this quote says is that knowledge building schools are not driven by external accountability, and I think this is an important message for people in schools. What knowledge building schools do, and schools that are responsive do, is they respond to the needs of students, which brings us back to what this is all about. And that commitment to do the best thing by all students is actually what leads us back into the data to ask those questions. The very first thing that you need to determine is what it is that you want to know. What is the question that I'm asking? What do I need to find out? Then, having asked that question, having determined what it is you want to know, you then have a look at, well, do I need to collect the data, or do I just need to access a data set that already exists? Do some analysis, set some priorities, develop some strategies from there, and very importantly, don't forget to follow up to make sure that actually what we thought might happen did happen and that we're getting a positive outcome. So that's a good little set of 6 guidelines for a strategy for approaching any type of data use. Now, some other questions that we could ask are things like, what are our data sources? What are the things that are actually out there in all government schools or in our government school that we might be able to use to help us? Who collects the data? When does the data get collected? Is it annually? Is it once every 10 years? Is it every term? How do we interpret it? And I've got a little note in there. Be wary of things like small cohorts. Always put your data in context. And this is a really important point to make when you're actually considering data. Context is actually very, very important to how you interpret the data. As a statistician or as a person who uses data all the time, I can look at the data sets for your schools, and there's all sorts of different ones I might look at, and I can draw some conclusions based on a statistical analysis of the numbers that I see in front of me. What I can't do is I can't, without some further knowledge, put that into context of that particular school. So if, for example, I'm looking at the data for a class of students, there's a few things I always have to consider, and there's a few basics that everyone should consider. How many students are in the cohort before I draw my averages? If you're talking about a group that's less than 5 students, well, obviously any type of result that we get there in terms of when we average it is going to be influenced by any student who actually performs significantly differently from the others. You'd all be aware, even if you have a larger group of students, they might all be sitting around the middle generally, except for 1 or 2 who are performing at a very, very high level. Now, when we average them, if I have a group up the top, that will actually affect what my average is looking like. But if I only look at the average, that doesn't tell me everything about that particular cohort. As another example, if I have 100 students and I give them a test and 50% of them, 50 of them score 0 and 50 of them score 100, very, very different performances by 2 groups of students, but the average will be 50. That's very different from giving that test to 100 students who all score 50. Tells me something very different. So be sensible about what you're looking at in your data sets. Don't just use one way of looking at the data. It's really important to cut your data in multiple ways. Have a think about the means, have a think about the spread of the data, what it looks like in bands. And all of this should be helping you to think about what are the targets for my school, what are the things that are actually mattering in my school, and of course bringing your context into that. So that's about interpreting the data. An important thing after that, though, is to think about how data is shared within your communities and within your schools. Sometimes there might be one person in a school or a small group of people in a school who have access to some really important information. You need to make some decisions in your school and community about how data is shared. Generally, the more widely it's shared, the better. More people have buy-in, more people have control and ownership of what's happening in the school, and more people can contribute their perspectives of the context into your school discussions. So think about, does everyone who needs to have that access actually have it? What do your teachers need to know? This is coming back to our theme for today about data prompting questions. Data in itself, numbers on the page, does not actually tell you everything you need to know. Sometimes the most valuable thing that you can do with data is to actually look at it and say, that's posing a question for me. And this comes back to what I was saying about myself. I might look at your data and say, well, you've got a lot of students in this particular band in this year, and then in the next year, there's a different profile. Now, I could make guesses as to why that is, but I couldn't tell you definitively why that is without actually knowing something about those students and your school. What I would hope is that if I came to your school, you could tell me that because you know the context. And I guess what you need to do always with your data sets, with your analysis, is to say, do I know why the data looks this way? If you're looking at your NAPLAN data, do I know why we have this particular pattern in the bands? Do I know why our mean is here? Do I know why this particular group does better than that particular group? If the answer to those is yes, yes I do know, well then you're in a good position. Sometimes though you have to say, well actually I'm not sure. I'm not really sure why it is that that's performing in that way. And that's the question. That's the important thing, is to then say, go out and find out why that is the case. When you know why the data performs the way it does, then you're in a position to do something about changing it and improving it. And of course, the last dot point about using data for school improvement is an important one. Should we change anything? Sometimes your results tell you that what you're doing is actually good, that you're actually on the right path. It can confirm that a change that you made 2 or 3 years ago or last year is actually having a positive effect. So that would be inclined to say, okay, let's continue with that and let's look at the other areas where maybe we're not doing so well and make changes. We shouldn't assume that data analysis automatically tells us that we have to change things. Sometimes it tells us that what we're doing is right.